Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and She Cried Before She Killed, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. She cried before killing, she wept at the altar before she slit his throat. And not a single soul in the church screamed. The wind howled through the crumbling arches of St. Hilda's, but it was not loud enough to mask the sound of the blood hitting the floor, thick, rhythmic, like rain that had waited too long to fall. Father Brown had arrived 30 seconds too late. 30 seconds. And in that sliver of time, something unspeakable had occurred. A woman, dressed in mourning black with trembling hands, knelt beside the body of her husband, with the bloodied knife still warm in her palm, and tears still streaking down her cheeks. The oddest thing, Father Brown would later say, wasn't the murder. It was the fact that she had cried long before she raised the blade, as though she had already grieved what she hadn't yet done, as though the guilt came before the sin. People in the village would whisper about Evelyn Brant for decades, the widow, the weeper, the one who wore her regret like perfume. She had been seen entering the chapel alone that evening, the chapel where her husband, Bernard Brant, had been leading a quiet Vesper service. Only 8 congregants, 2 candles, and a hymnal left open to a song no one remembered singing. And yet when they found him, slumped over the altar rail with his collar soaked red, Evelyn was already on her knees, hands clasped as if praying, the weapon laid across her lap like a child offering penance. She didn't run, she didn't speak, she simply waited. But Father Brown, ever the unlikely detective, in his crumpled cassock and muddied shoes, looked beyond the surface, and what he saw chilled him. Evelyn's hands were trembling, yes, but not in panic, in control. She hadn't collapsed from shock. Her breathing was even, her pulse deliberate. And when she looked at him, finally, with those tear-streaked eyes, he saw something he would never admit aloud. He saw peace. "I'm sorry, Father," she whispered as they led her away. "But you know better than anyone. Not all sins are equal." She never confessed. Not even once during her trial. Not when the judge asked if she had anything to say. Not when the village condemned her in the market square. She remained silent. Her silence was louder than any defense. And it was that silence that haunted Father Brown, more than the blood, more than the blade, more than the prayer that hadn't been finished. Why cry before killing? Unless the act was not the crime at all. Days passed. Father Brown found himself walking the chapel grounds again and again, returning to that final moment, her weeping. He noticed strange things others ignored. The hymnal on the lectern hadn't been opened by Bernard. It was open to a page Evelyn preferred. A lullaby, not a vesper. And that meant she had been there before he arrived. But why? There was no sign of struggle, no sign of rage. And Bernard's wounds, though brutal, were oddly precise, as if performed not in fury, but in familiarity, almost surgical. But Evelyn was no doctor. She was a painter, a woman who hadn't lifted a carving knife since their wedding roast. So who taught her to kill like that? The coroner's report said Bernard died instantly. But Father Brown noticed something strange. One of Bernard's shoes was missing, and the other had a scuff mark not caused by struggle, but by force, like someone had stepped on it, held him down. Evelyn couldn't have done that, not alone. So the real question wasn't why she killed. It was why she wanted to be seen doing it. Father Brown visited her in the county jail, a place that reeked of damp cloth and older sins. She sat on the edge of her cot, painting with her finger on the wall. No paint, just motion. "Still trying to finish your last piece?" he asked gently. She didn't smile, but her eyes met his. "It was never my last piece, Father. Just the only one they'll remember." He stayed silent, watching her. She blinked slowly, her lashes casting long shadows on her cheek. "Do you believe in punishment?" she asked suddenly. "Or in completion?" "Justice is what's left when mercy breaks," he replied. She paused, and then whispered, "Then you already know. I didn't kill Bernard. I ended something that should have never begun." The words were vague, convenient, infuriatingly poetic, but there was truth in them. He could feel it, like the shape of something hidden behind wallpaper, impossible to name, but undeniably real. 2 days later, Evelyn tried to hang herself with her bedsheet. She failed, or someone stopped her. The guards wouldn't say which, but in the report, Father Brown saw one chilling detail. Carved into the wall, with nothing but her fingernail, were 4 words. "He made me forget." The village assumed it meant madness, trauma. But Brown knew better. It wasn't about forgetting memories. It was about forgetting who she was. He returned to the Brandt house, now boarded up and empty. The garden had overgrown. The curtains still swayed in broken windows, but in the cellar, he found something that froze the air around him. Dozens of canvases, unfinished, slashed, burned. Faces erased, figures with mouths, but no eyes. And one, near the back, completely intact, a painting of Evelyn. Not as she was, but younger, different, radiant, alive. Beside her stood Bernard, but his face had been altered, repainted, once, twice, dozens of times, like someone desperately trying to erase the truth with every brushstroke. And then, at the edge of the canvas, barely visible, a third figure. Small, faded. A child. No birth records, no graves, no nursery. Nothing. Evelyn had no child. At least, not anymore. The next morning, Father Brown visited the cemetery. Bernard had no headstone. Evelyn's family refused to bury him on consecrated ground. But there, in a forgotten corner, was a tiny plot. No name, just a date. Only one person had wept when that child was buried. And that person had stopped painting the day she stopped remembering her own daughter. The pieces were falling into place. But the picture still didn't make sense. If Bernard had taken the child, where was the proof? Why the silence? Why would Evelyn admit to a murder she didn't commit, unless the act itself was her justice? Father Brown spoke once more to Evelyn. She looked thinner, paler, but her voice had grown firmer. "I didn't kill him because of what he did to me," she said. "I killed him because of what he taught me to live with." Brown stared at her for a long time. "You cried before you killed him." "I was saying goodbye," she said softly, "to the woman I had to be." The next week, a letter arrived at the presbytery. No return address, just a single sheet inside, a page torn from Evelyn's sketchbook. The image, a church, burning in the rain, and in front of it, a woman holding a child, both made of light. Below the drawing, a single line. "Not all flames destroy. Some reveal." Father Brown never spoke of what he saw in the chapel that night. He never testified, never revealed the missing shoe, never submitted the painting to the authorities. But he kept one item in his study, behind a locked drawer: the knife. not as evidence, but as reminder. Some truths aren't meant for courtrooms. Some truths sit between the silence of a weeping woman and the blood that proves she didn't weep in vain. And when a child cries in the night, Father Brown sometimes wakes in cold sweat, not because he fears evil, but because he now understands how quiet it can be. He knows who did it, but the truth will never be told. Chapter 2. The Motive Brown. Almost missed. They found the body posed like a saint, hands folded, eyes closed, and lips sewn shut with black thread that didn't belong to the victim. The woman was dead before she was made beautiful. That was the first thing Father Brown noticed. Not the blood, not the oddly peaceful expression, but the lie of serenity stitched into her face like a mask. Martha Elridge, schoolteacher, spinster, and the most ruthlessly punctual woman in Kembleford, was late to nothing, and yet she was found 2 days after anyone noticed she was gone, buried beneath wildflowers in the orchard she'd forbidden children to play in for decades. It wasn't just murder, it was artistic punishment. The village was unsettled in a way that couldn't be comforted by scripture or routine. Martha had been many things: strict, sharp-tongued, private, but no one thought of her as worth killing. And perhaps that was the problem. No one thought of her at all, except clearly someone did. Enough to silence her voice permanently and bury her in a place where children laughed. Father Brown was called not because the police needed help, but because the scene was so unnaturally composed. Something sacred desecrated in disguise. Her hands were wrapped around a small wooden crucifix, not hers. Her rosary beads were laid across her lap, also not hers. And the school bell was missing, gone from its usual chain in the front room. Why take a bell? Why silence a voice that was already dead? Brown stood alone in the orchard as the sun bled out behind the hedgerow. There was something cruel in the silence, something too neat. The body had been arranged. The soil had been softened, not by tools, but by hands. And beneath her fingers, there was wax, candle wax, a burnt circle where no candle had been found. He asked around, of course. The children were frightened, but remembered that Miss Elridge had closed school early the day she disappeared. Odd. She never dismissed them early, not even in storms. Even odder. One boy swore he'd seen her arguing with someone in the lane the day before. A man, with a red scarf. There were only 2 men in the village known for wearing red scarves. One was blind, the other was dead. The blind man, Harold Finch, had once proposed to Miss Elridge, or so the gossip went. She had refused, quietly, firmly, but he had always remained close. Father Brown found Harold in his usual spot, feeding breadcrumbs to birds he could no longer see. "I didn't see her that day, Father. I haven't seen her in years. But someone said they saw you speaking with her." "I speak to ghosts sometimes," Harold said, smiling faintly. "They don't talk back." Father Brown let the silence stretch. It wasn't Harold, at least not directly, but the words he used mattered. The autopsy revealed something even stranger. Martha had no defensive wounds, no bruises, no signs of forced trauma. She had been suffocated, gently, with something soft. Silk, likely. A pillow, perhaps. It wasn't rage. It was calculated, almost ritualistic. And then there was the black thread, industrial, not something a villager would own. Tailor's thread, not used for clothing, used for binding books. Books. That led Father Brown to the one place he hated visiting, the attic of the old Kembleford schoolhouse. He climbed through the dust, past stacks of forgotten textbooks and water-damaged ledgers, and there, buried beneath a crate of hymnals, he found it, a tattered red scarf, covered in wax, smelling faintly of lilies. But not just that. Underneath the scarf, wrapped in oilskin, was a leather-bound journal. Not Martha's, a man's handwriting. Harsh, slanted, bleeding into the margins. The journal belonged to Edward Kent, the other man known for wearing red scarves, the one who died 5 years ago. A suicide, or so they said. He'd been a teacher once, replaced after a scandal no one would name. And in the journal, page after page, confessions, dark, obsessive. One entry repeated over and over again. She remembers what I want to forget. Martha Elridge had testified privately in the inquiry into Kent's misconduct. The records were sealed, but something had kept her silent. Guilt or fear. Father Brown brought the journal to the inspector, but it vanished from evidence the next day. Someone wanted the memory erased, and that's when he saw it. In the corner of the schoolroom, carved into the underside of Martha's old desk, initials, not hers, E.K. and M.E., and beside them, newer marks, fresh. The same kind of thread used to bind the journal was used to sew her lips. She hadn't been murdered to hide a secret. She had been murdered because she remembered one. Father Brown visited her home again. The police had cleared it, but he searched differently, slowly, thoughtfully, and in her nightstand drawer, hidden beneath false bottoms and forgotten rosaries, he found it. A single photograph, old, faded. 2 girls. One was Martha, unmistakably. The other, he realized, was a girl who had disappeared 30 years ago. Beatrice Tull, the girl no one ever found, the girl who vanished after her last detention. Martha had known. She had always known. But why wait? Why stay silent for decades? That's when Father Brown almost missed it. The motive. Not guilt. Shame. Martha hadn't spoken because she had believed she was part of it. As a girl, as a witness, maybe even as someone who said nothing when it first happened. She had let the world believe Edward Kent killed himself. But he didn't. Someone had silenced him, just like Martha, with silk, with thread, with careful cruelty. And now, years later, someone feared she would finally confess. But who? The inspector? No. He was too new. The blind man? No. Too broken. And then Father Brown realized it was the children, not the students, the grown ones, the children who had been in Kent's classroom 30 years ago. One of them had followed Martha. One of them had watched her. One of them had stitched her mouth shut to keep the past from bleeding into the future. But which one? There were 3. One was a priest. One was a constable. One was a headmaster. And all of them had alibis. All of them denied ever knowing Beatrice. All of them smiled a little too tightly when Martha's name was mentioned. Father Brown sat beneath the orchard tree that night, staring at the place where she had been buried. The scent of wax still lingered in the grass, and he realized something else. The school bell had been taken not as a trophy, but as a warning, because it rang when no one was near, because it rang the night before Martha was killed, because someone had rung it one last time, and only Martha had heard it. A signal, a call, an invitation. She hadn't been surprised when her killer came. She had been expecting them. She had forgiven them. And that was the motive Father Brown almost missed. Not revenge, but mercy. She had let the killer believe she still loved them, still trusted them. She had accepted the invitation, smiled at the memory of innocence that had long since curdled. And when they wept before killing her, she wept with them, because even now, after everything, she still remembered who they used to be. Father Brown never said the name aloud, not even once. He simply stood in front of the three men one morning after Mass, held up the tattered scarf, and watched their faces. One blinked, one laughed, one flinched. He knew then. But the past, like the dead, is not always best unearthed. "I know who did it," Father Brown would later say, quietly, to no one in particular, "but the truth will never be told, because some motives aren't made of rage, but of the terrible love we feel for the people we've ruined." Chapter 3. The confession came too late. He choked on the first word of his confession, because the second one had already killed him. It was a cold Wednesday when Father Brown was called to listen to a dying man. Not for absolution, not for comfort, but for something darker, something that begged to be spoken after being buried alive for more than 3 decades. The man's name was Lawrence Gellner, a former constable turned recluse, and no one had seen him in public since the night of the Arkwright fire, a night that was whispered about but never properly explained, a night that burned more than just timber. That fire, 29 years ago, had taken a child's life, or so they claimed. Lawrence had summoned Father Brown with urgency in his voice, but when the priest arrived, the man was already drifting in and out of breath. His skin was pale, the color of candle wax, and his eyes flickered toward the door as if he feared whoever had allowed him to live this long might still be listening. And then he opened his mouth. One word, just one. "Clara." That was it. He died before saying anything else. And yet the moment Father Brown heard it, he froze, because Clara Arkwright was the child who supposedly perished in the fire. The child they never found. Only bones, they said. But even the bones were too few. The coroner blamed the heat. The villagers blamed fate. But Father Brown had always quietly blamed something else. He never spoke of it, never pursued it. There had been no proof, and the fire had destroyed everything, or so it seemed. But now, this dying ex-constable, the man who had been first to the scene, the man who had vanished from duty after the case, whispered the name of the girl whose death never felt quite right. Clara. The name rippled through Father Brown's memory like blood in water. He began asking questions, the kind no one wanted answered. The Arkwright estate had long since been abandoned, overgrown with ivy and rot. He visited anyway. In the ruins of the nursery, there was still a faint outline scorched into the floorboards, just large enough for a cradle. But the walls told a different story. Scrawled into the beams, barely visible beneath peeling paint and soot, were childish drawings, dozens of them, all of a girl with long braids, all standing beside a tall figure, the same figure over and over again, a man with no face. And above one of the drawings, scratched into the wood, "He told me not to scream." Father Brown returned to the village with a chill spreading through his bones that the sun couldn't melt. He asked after Clara's mother, Evelyn Arkwright, now in her 70s and living under a different name in a care home 3 towns over. She had never remarried, never rebuilt. She had, it was said, forgotten. But when Father Brown entered her room and introduced himself, Evelyn did not act surprised. "You've come because he died, haven't you?" she said, staring at nothing. "Lawrence always said he'd talk before his lungs did." "What happened to Clara?" Father Brown asked gently. Evelyn didn't answer right away. Her hands, pale and trembling, gripped the edges of her blanket. "They told me she was gone," she said after a long silence. "They said the fire left nothing, but I never saw the remains, never touched them, and I remember hearing her scream, even after the flames stopped." She began to weep, but not from grief, from shame. I knew, she whispered. I knew something wasn't right. But I let them tell me it was my grief making me mad. Father Brown asked her again, this time more softly. Who told you? Evelyn looked him in the eye and said, my brother, the doctor. Dr. Malcolm Thorne had been the village's physician for nearly 40 years, a man respected, trusted, and feared in the way only cold men with credentials can be. He had signed the death certificate. He had overseen the cremation of the so-called remains. He had never spoken of the case again. And now he was the only living man who could have known what Lawrence Gellner meant to confess. Father Brown visited the doctor's home, a large grey building with spotless windows and heavy curtains. The door opened before he knocked. I've been expecting you, Dr. Thorne said, not as a greeting, but as a warning. They sat in the study. Tea was offered, refused. Father Brown went straight to it. Was Clara Arkwright ever buried? Dr. Thorne did not blink. A child's death is always a tragedy, Father, sometimes more for the living than the dead. That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving. Father Brown left, with no evidence, no confession, just the unbearable certainty that he was standing at the edge of something too dark to name. That night, he broke into the doctor's house, not out of desperation, but out of purpose. In the basement, beneath surgical tools and bookshelves too orderly to be honest, he found a door, locked, reinforced, strange for a man who lived alone. He forced it open. The room smelled of old dust and something worse, faded perfume. Inside was a single rocking chair, and behind it, lining the walls, were shelves of dolls, all with braided hair, all in identical blue dresses, and in the farthest corner, one photograph. A young woman, older than Clara would have been when she died, alive, but her eyes were hollow. The name on the back of the photo, Clara, 1943-1961. She would have been 20, the year after Lawrence Gellner quit the force, the year after the fire, the year after the lie was sealed. Father Brown staggered back, heart pounding with the weight of revelation. She had survived, or rather, she had been taken, hidden, moved, and the fire was not an accident. It was a cover, a curtain drawn to disguise the real crime. And then came the true horror. Clara had lived for 18 more years, somewhere no one could see her, and now no one knew. No body, no grave, no trail. Only a room full of dolls, a locked door, and a man too composed to be innocent. When Father Brown returned to the care home, Evelyn Arkwright was already gone. Died in her sleep, they said, peacefully. But on her nightstand was a single item, a doll, braided hair, blue dress, and sewn into its hem, barely visible, the letter C. The confession had come too late to save Clara, too late to bring justice, too late to stop the story from rotting into silence. Father Brown never confronted Dr. Thorne again. He knew the man would never speak. He also knew that the dead don't always haunt. Sometimes they hide, and sometimes they're hidden for us, to keep us from seeing what kind of world would rather burn a house than ask the right questions. I know what happened to her, Father Brown whispered once, alone in the orchard that spring. But the truth died screaming. Chapter 4. Her alibi had no sound. She said she was in the room the whole time, but the clock never ticked, the floor never creaked, and no one heard her breathe. The murder of Dr. Felix Ward shook the village of Lanchester, not because he was beloved, but because he wasn't. He was a man of order, of harsh punishments and sharper words, the sort who remembered debts and grudges, but forgot kindness. And yet, When his body was discovered at the base of the library staircase, neck broken, face twisted, in something like surprise, everyone agreed on one thing. Whoever killed him had done it quietly and completely. Father Brown arrived long after. The constables had roped off the study. The rain had soaked the carpet where the body had lain, and the wooden banister showed no signs of struggle. No drag marks, no blood. But there was something wrong about the silence. Too neat, too rehearsed. The kind of silence that comes after a performance has ended, and no one wants to speak about what they just saw. Only one person claimed to be in the house when Dr. Ward died. Eliza Wren, his maid for nearly 20 years. A quiet woman with sunken eyes and a voice so soft it was often mistaken for absence. She said she was cleaning the silverware in the dining room, said she heard nothing, said she was alone. But there was a problem. The dining room had wooden floors, dry and loose, the kind that squeaked at the whisper of movement. And yet no one, not even the neighbor whose windows faced the house, heard a single sound. Not the clink of cutlery, not the scrape of a chair. Nothing. Eliza Wren's alibi had no sound, and that, Father Brown would later say, was the loudest thing in the case. He questioned her gently, asked what she remembered. She repeated her story, word for word, as if it had been practiced. And it had, because Eliza had been practicing silence her entire life. She had grown up in the convent orphanage. She had taken a vow of quiet in her youth. She was a girl who had learned early that noise brought pain. Still, something in her face flickered when Father Brown asked about the doctor's study. A slight shift, a blink too slow. "Did you go near the library that day?" he asked. "No, Father," she said. Her voice was soft, flat, like a hand pressed against a closed door. "But you always bring him tea at 4, and he died at 4:15. She paused. "I was late," she said. The kettle boiled over. Father Brown didn't press her. Not then. But he noticed the next thing. A bruise on her wrist. Faint. Fading. Not recent, but not ancient either. "She fell," the constable said. "Slipped on the kitchen tiles the day before. But the kitchen tiles had rugs. Padded. Dry. And Eliza didn't limp." Father Brown returned to the library. He stood at the top of the staircase, counted the steps, then closed his eyes. The fall wouldn't have killed a man like Ward. Not instantly. Not unless he was pushed backward, head first. And the angle would have required someone taller. Eliza Wren was 5'2". Dr. Ward was 6 feet. And that's when the case should have ended. But it didn't. Because that night, a letter was slipped under Father Brown's door. No name, just a piece of paper, handwritten in fine ink. He screamed before he fell. That single sentence rewrote the entire case, because Eliza said she heard nothing, which meant either the letter was a lie or Eliza Wren was. Father Brown searched the property again, this time slowly, patiently, and in the attic, sealed behind a wardrobe, he found a small iron key, one that matched nothing in the current house. But Father Brown had seen keys like it before, in confessional booths, old church models, from before the fire. He went to the parish archives, dug through crumbling folders, and there it was. Dr. Felix Ward had once chaired the board that ordered the closure of St. Matilda's Home for Girls, the same home Eliza Wren had grown up in, the same home that had mysteriously burned in 1899, leaving no survivors except 6 children, all relocated, records sealed. But one page remained, a disciplinary record, Eliza Wren. Multiple silences, uncooperative, deemed unstable, seclusion ordered, recommended re-education. and beside the record, a list of names. One of them, scrawled in thick, angry ink, Ward, Felix, visiting physician. He had known her, long before she became his maid, long before the village knew her as quiet and loyal. She hadn't just served him, she had survived him. And suddenly, the silence made sense. She hadn't spoken because no one had listened before. Not as a child, not as a girl behind locked doors, not as a maid in his house. Until the moment he screamed. And even then, no one came. Father Brown went back to the house, asked her, plainly, "Did you push him?" Eliza stared at him for a long time. "No," she said, "I didn't need to." Then she walked to the cabinet, opened a drawer, and handed him a tape recorder. Old, dusty, out of place. "I wanted to remember the sound," she said. He pressed play. Static, silence, then footsteps, harsh breathing, a male voice. "Eliza, what did you see?" Then, her voice. "I never stopped seeing." And then, a scream, a thud, silence. Father Brown turned off the recorder. "Why did you keep this?" he asked. "I wasn't trying to hide what happened," she said softly. "I was proving it." The sound was her alibi, but no one had asked to listen. Eliza Wren was never charged. There wasn't enough evidence. The recorder vanished from police custody. Some said it never existed. Some said Father Brown fabricated the whole thing to protect her. Some say he never solved it at all. But every year, on the anniversary of Dr. Ward's death, a single bell rings in the church tower, even though no one pulls the rope. And Father Brown once whispered to a friend in the dark, "She didn't kill him because of what he did." He paused. "She killed him because the silence never ended." And this was the only sound anyone would finally believe. Chapter 5. The blood spoke without words. The victim never opened her mouth, but when the blood seeped beneath the floorboards, it spelled something no one could explain. It started on a Thursday morning, with the sound of dripping in a house that was meant to be empty. The old Langridge residence had been shuttered for almost a year after the sudden departure of its owner, Miss Eleanor Gray. No farewell letter, no public sale, just vanished. Some said she went to France. Others whispered she'd gone mad and was locked away. But no one expected her to return, certainly not like this. The postman found her body, or rather, he found the puddle of blood that led him to her. It trailed from the back garden, under the porch, and into the foyer, where she lay collapsed against the wall, with her eyes wide open and her hands perfectly folded over her chest, like a woman waiting to be buried, not murdered. Her throat had been slit cleanly. No mess, no struggle, no signs of panic. But there was something so wrong about the way she was positioned, like she'd known it was coming, like she agreed to it. Father Brown arrived quietly, without announcement, and without blessing the body. Not yet. He stood in the doorway for a long time, his eyes not on Eleanor, but on the red trail leading from her chest down through the wooden floorboards. He didn't ask where it led. He already knew. And when the constables pulled up the planks, their hands shaking, they revealed something no one had seen in Kembleford before. Words, not written in ink, not carved in wood, but stained in blood, beneath the floor, as if the house itself had bled her final message. 4 letters, 4 cruel, unmistakable letters, a VEL, not a name anyone recognized, not the name of a lover or rival. But still, something about it rang too sharp to be coincidence, as if it had been waiting there, below her feet, this whole time. The blood hadn't trickled randomly. It had followed the shape already cut beneath the wood, carved decades earlier, long before Eleanor had moved in. But who had carved it? And why? Father Brown stayed silent through the inquest. Eleanor's death was ruled a homicide, but no one could place a suspect. The locks hadn't been tampered with. There were no footprints, no broken windows, no sign of forced entry. No one in town had seen her return, and yet she had clearly lived in the house for several days before she died. There were signs of tea being brewed, a fresh bed made, letters, unposted, sitting on the hallway table, but no writing, not a single word in her hand, just that blood-soaked floorboard spelling out something that made no sense, and yet felt too personal to ignore. The first twist came with the autopsy. Eleanor had not bled to death from the wound. The throat slash had come after her heart stopped. Her actual cause of death was an embolism. Sudden, internal, silent. She had died of natural causes. The cut was post-mortem. Clean. Ceremonial. Someone had found her body, and rather than call for help, they had sliced open her throat to complete something. Father Brown's investigation began with the house itself. He walked the rooms like he was retracing the thoughts of a ghost. The curtains were all drawn, but not to hide anything. They had been carefully hemmed with thread that didn't match. The fabric, black thread, like a mourning veil. He noticed, too, that every mirror in the house was covered with lace, not draped, sewn, and in the guest bedroom, hidden in the wardrobe's base, he found a child's shoe. Leather, burned around the edges. Stamped on the sole was a name worn thin from age. Aveline, the missing name, the missing child. The name the blood had tried to say. He searched the archives, dug deep, and there it was, a record of a house fire from 1912. Langridge House had been partially destroyed. One girl reported missing, Aveline Ward, age 6, never found. Her mother had died in the blaze. The house had passed into private ownership, and over the years it became a place of bad dreams. Tenants came and went, none stayed more than a season. But Eleanor Gray had lived there almost 8 years, alone, quiet, reclusive, until she vanished, until she came back, until she died, right on top of the name the house had been trying to whisper all along. But what did Eleanor have to do with Aveline Ward? Father Brown found the last living nurse from the girls' orphanage just outside Lanchester, a frail woman named Edith, who, at the mention of Eleanor's name, went rigid. She wasn't always Eleanor, the woman said. Who was she? She was the girl they never claimed, the one who said nothing for 5 years, never spoke, just drew pictures, always of fire, and a doll named Aveline. But the girl in the fire died. No, Edith whispered, she survived, but something in her didn't. Eleanor Gray had been Aveline Ward's sister, or half-sister. The records were unclear. But what mattered was this. She had been in the house the night of the fire, and she had watched her mother burn. And Aveline? No one knew. But Eleanor had returned to the house for a reason, and someone else knew she was back. Someone who came not to kill her, but to finish a message started decades earlier. Father Brown returned to Langridge House once more. This time, he focused not on what was there, but what wasn't. The floorboard with the blood-stained letters had been removed by the police, but the subfloor remained, and underneath it, in a crawl space no one had dared enter, he found it. A box, old, metal, locked. Inside were scraps of burned fabric, charred porcelain, the head of a doll, and a single page from a children's Bible, the story of Cain and Abel. But the final verse had been underlined in ash. Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Eleanor hadn't died because of what she did. She died because of what she remembered. And someone still breathing, had been listening for that blood. But who? That night, the parish was broken into. Nothing was taken, except the recorder Father Brown had used to log his thoughts, and the photo of Eleanor as a child, standing beside a girl who had been listed as dead. But most chilling of all, someone had drawn in blood across the altar. I remember now. Father Brown would never again walk past Langridge House. It remained locked, its windows boarded, its garden unkempt. But the earth beneath the steps always seemed wet, even when it hadn't rained. And one night, long after the case was considered cold, he stood outside the gate and whispered. The blood spoke without words, but someone heard it anyway. He paused, and then added softly, to the darkness around him, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Chapter 6. He smiled before he died. He smiled before the knife touched his throat, not because he didn't fear death, but because he finally knew whose hands would deliver it. The morning Charles Denham was found dead on the church steps, it wasn't the blood that shocked Father Brown. It was the grin frozen on his face, like a man who had just heard the punchline to a joke only he understood. His eyes were wide open, his hands outstretched as if offering something invisible, and around his neck, delicately tied with a white ribbon, was a single black button. Not his. Wrong size, wrong style. And worse, it was clean, despite everything else soaked in red. Charles wasn't the kind of man to die quietly. He was a magistrate, a relentless letter writer, a man with enemies too many to count, and humility small enough to drown in a spoon. He judged harshly, forgave never, and remembered insults like Holy Scripture. But still, no one expected his life to end this way. Ritualistic, staged, like some morbid message. The ribbon, the button, the smile, they didn't belong in the world of random violence. They belonged to something intentional, something personal. The coroner's report ruled it a swift, precise incision. No struggle, no hesitation. Whoever had done it knew anatomy, or had done it before. But there were no defensive wounds, no bruises, which meant Charles hadn't fought back. He had accepted it. He had welcomed it. That's when Father Brown knew this wasn't a murder in the ordinary sense. This was a reckoning. The days that followed brought more confusion than clarity. The constables found no murder weapon, no footprints, no broken locks. Charles's estate showed no signs of disturbance. His last letter, sent the evening prior, was addressed to a woman named Celia Moregrave, a name that hadn't been spoken in Kembleford for nearly 15 years. Celia had vanished after a scandal. Rumors of bribery, a court case involving her brother. Charles had presided over the trial, harshly, unforgivingly. Her brother was sentenced to life in prison. 2 months later, he was dead, hanging, officially suicide. Unofficially, revenge lingered in every whispered conversation for months. No one ever found Celia. No one tried. Until now. Because suddenly, someone remembered her. And the memory wore lipstick and silence like armor. Father Brown asked to see Charles's final correspondence. The letter he sent to Celia wasn't a letter at all. It was a confession, not to a crime, but to a betrayal. He had known her brother wasn't guilty. He had pushed the conviction forward anyway, out of pride, out of power, out of something worse, a wager made with another judge, long since dead. And now, in trembling penmanship, Charles wrote 4 final words. She was always right. Father Brown stared at the page for hours, not because he was surprised, but because the words sounded less like guilt and more like a surrender. He asked about visitors, about new faces in the village. One man mentioned seeing a woman in grey, standing at Charles's gate 2 nights before the murder. She wore gloves despite the heat, a scarf that hid her neck, and a peculiar brooch, a black button, turned into jewelry. She didn't speak, she didn't need to, because her silence said what the law never had. Father Brown went to the train station, asked for recent departures. One clerk remembered the woman in grey. She'd left the morning after Charles died. Bought a ticket in cash. No name, no luggage, just a notebook in her hand. And when she dropped it, the clerk swore he saw the name Celia etched faintly inside the cover. But when Father Brown searched the platform later, he didn't find the notebook. He found something else. Tucked behind the timetable, barely visible, another black button, threaded with red. He pocketed it, quietly. That evening, he visited Charles's study again. It had been sealed by the constables, but the housekeeper let him in. Said she'd heard something the night before the murder. Not shouting, not movement, laughter, 2 voices, low, familiar. One of them was Charles's. The other? She only said it made her skin crawl. Not because it sounded angry, but because it sounded forgiving. Father Brown found no other letters, but he did find a book, pressed between volumes on Roman law, a children's book, the kind Celia Moregrave used to read aloud in the town square when she was 17. Inside it, someone had underlined a line in pencil. Even the lion weeps when it remembers being the lamb. The final twist came in the form of a drawing, left on the church steps 3 days later. Charcoal, simple but unmistakable. A man, smiling, sitting on a throne, and above him, in a child's handwriting, "I forgive you now." There was no signature, but the back of the page was stitched, with the thread pattern used by a finishing school Celia Moregrave once attended. Only 6 women in the region still knew that stitch. One of them had been presumed dead. One of them just walked out of a village like she had only ever paused her story. And Father Brown? He never told the constables what he saw in the drawing, never told them about the button, never revealed the final page of the children's book, because when he closed the case in his mind, he understood something no jury ever could. Charles Denham had died smiling because he believed he was finally forgiven. But the smile wasn't peace, it was punishment, the kind that lets you feel absolved just seconds before you die. And Father Brown, standing outside the chapel at dusk, whispered to himself, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told, because some justice doesn't shout, it smiles." Chapter 7. The truth Brown kept hidden. Father Brown had buried bodies before, but this time he was burying a truth that could destroy everything he believed in. It started with a whisper in the confessional, not a voice, but a breath, trembling, fractured, barely more than a gasp. The woman never gave her name. She didn't need to. The silence between her sentences told him more than any admission ever could. "He's going to die," she said, "and I'll be standing there when he does." Then she left. No more. No penance. No prayer. Just the hollow footsteps of someone already at war with their soul. Father Brown should have told the police. He should have said something. But he didn't. He kept it quiet, thinking perhaps he could stop whatever was coming. He was wrong. 3 days later, Ambrose Hill, the wealthy landowner who had nearly destroyed the village during a failed rail project years ago, was found dead. Not poisoned, not stabbed, not shot. His body was intact, but his mind wasn't. The medical report was clear. Sudden cardiac failure, likely triggered by extreme psychological trauma. He had been found in the sitting room of his manor, hands frozen in a defensive gesture, eyes wide open, face twisted in terror. He had died afraid, utterly afraid, and yet there wasn't a single mark on his body, except one. His tongue had been cut out, not torn, cut cleanly. The constables called it a desecration, an act of vengeance after death. But there was no blood on the floor, which meant it was done before he died. And if that was true, then Ambrose Hill had lived for several minutes or longer without the ability to speak, and somehow smiling. Yes, smiling. Father Brown arrived before the coroner took the body. He saw it with his own eyes, a faint curl at the corner of the lips, a smile made of madness or mercy. He couldn't tell, but he recognized one thing. He'd seen that same smile before. In the portrait that used to hang in the orphanage he visited every Christmas. A painting of a young girl, long gone now, who had once claimed Ambrose Hill had taken something from her, something no one had believed. She had died that same winter, jumped from a bridge. No witnesses, no letters. The case had been buried beneath a landslide of donations, cover-ups, and polite silence. Until now. The constables had no suspects, no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, and most importantly, no motive. Ambrose had been retired, isolated, irrelevant, but someone hadn't forgotten. Father Brown walked the grounds of the manor, not looking for evidence, looking for memory. The way the hedges were trimmed, the locked greenhouse, the chapel out back, abandoned since his wife's funeral 10 years prior. And it was there, in that chapel, he found the first clue. A small glass bottle tucked beneath the altar cloth. Perfume, cheap, faded, but with one scent unmistakably present. Gardenia. The same perfume the woman in the confessional had worn. He remembered it, not because it was familiar, but because it was wrong. No one wore perfume to confession. It lingered like a warning, like a dare. He took the bottle and followed the only path that made sense, not through evidence, through guilt. He visited the orphanage archives, looked up the girl in the painting. Her name was Elsie. No last name. She'd been brought in after a fire. Her parents presumed dead. She had spoken very little, but one file, barely legible now, mentioned something chilling. Fear of men in uniform, night terrors, repeated statements. He visits when the lights go out. The caseworker had made note of this, only once. Then it vanished from all records, except one. Father Brown kept a private notebook, not a journal, not a diary, a list of all the things he had failed to save. Elsie's name was on it, and beside her name, written in ink he barely remembered using, were two words, not imagined. He had believed her, but he had not acted. Now someone else had. And he knew, with every breath, every heartbeat, that the murder of Ambrose Hill was not revenge. It was justice. Dark, unholy, but justice nonetheless. Then came the reveal. In the garden, behind the greenhouse, buried beneath the rosebush planted the year Ambrose's wife died, the police found something strange. Bones, small, not human, animal, but beside them, wrapped in oilskin, was a locket. Inside it, a picture of Ambrose and a girl. Not Elsie, someone else, unlabeled. But behind the image, a date, the day before the orphanage fire, which meant there had been another child, a second victim, one never recorded, one deliberately erased. The smile made sense now. Ambrose hadn't died in fear. He had died recognizing the face of someone he thought he had destroyed, but she hadn't come to scream. She had come to silence him, and succeeded. Father Brown never told the constables what he knew. He didn't tell them about the bottle. He didn't reveal the confession. He didn't open the second notebook, the one only he knew how to read. Because the truth wasn't just dangerous, It was deserved. Some secrets are protected because they are too powerful to speak. Others because they are too cruel to believe. And as he walked away from the grave, Father Brown whispered into the wind, "I know who did it." But the truth was never meant to be spoken, only heard in silence by those who once weren't. Chapter 8. The Scream That Didn't Match. The scream they heard in the woods didn't belong to the woman who was found, and by the time they realized it, the one who truly screamed was already buried. It was supposed to be a quiet festival evening, just before the fireworks. The entire village had gathered by the riverbank, lanterns glowing like fireflies in the dusk, laughter rising like smoke through the trees. But as the band reached the final note of the hymn, and the last firecracker whistled into the sky, the crowd froze, because from the woods beyond the field came a scream so sharp, so human, so wrong. It cut straight through the joy, like a blade. Father Brown was standing near the back of the congregation. He didn't run like the others. He listened. The scream was high-pitched, frantic, but not just frightened, confused. And then, silence. By the time they found the body, 20 minutes had passed. It was Florence Hale, young, cheerful, well known in the village for her kindness and her habit of humming when she walked. She was lying face down in the mud, her hands curled into fists, her mouth bloodied. No weapon was found, no defensive wounds. But her shoes were gone, her legs scraped raw, and one of her earrings, a delicate gold stud shaped like a cross, was pressed into her palm, like she had ripped it out herself. People said the scream belonged to her. Of course they did. She was the one dead. But Father Brown, standing at the edge of the clearing, didn't nod like the rest. He frowned, not at the body, at the air, at the silence that followed the scream. It was the kind of silence that absorbed something, the kind that knows more than it reveals. The constables asked questions. Who had seen Florence last? Who was she with? Everyone said the same thing. She had gone off to fetch more candles from the cart parked near the woods. She had been smiling, humming. She hadn't looked afraid. No one followed her. No one heard anything but that scream. But Father Brown knew better. He asked how many candles she had taken. They said 6. Only 5 were recovered. He went to the cart himself, looked beneath it, in the grass, in the wheel ruts, nothing. But the candle box had a smear of something faintly red near the handle. Not blood, lipstick, a smudge too high to be Florence's. Florence never wore lipstick. The autopsy came the next morning. Cause of death, asphyxiation. Not manual strangulation, not suffocation. Something more violent, but less direct. Her larynx was crushed from the inside. She had tried to scream, and failed, but the scream heard in the woods was clear, loud, full. So if Florence didn't scream, who did? Father Brown returned to the clearing that afternoon. He found a patch of disturbed moss by the tree line about 20 feet from where Florence had fallen. And there, caught in the bark of a nearby tree, was a shred of cloth, black, silk, not part of Florence's, clothing. There had been someone else in the woods, someone who screamed first, someone who was never found. That night, Father Brown visited Florence's mother. She was inconsolable, but when he asked gently about Florence's past, she said something strange. Florence had been receiving letters, anonymous. At first, harmless, but lately, troubling. The last one had arrived the day before the festival. Florence had burned it. But in the grate, buried beneath ashes, Father Brown found the edge of a page, and on it, the words, "I know who you saw." The constables dismissed it, called it gossip, But Father Brown started tracing the rumor. Who had Florence seen? And when? The breakthrough came from a child, 7 years old, playing near the woods with his older brother that evening. He told Father Brown he had seen 2 women walk past him. One was Florence. The other was the woman who looked like her. What did that mean? She had her hair, her coat, but her face was wrong. Wrong how? She was crying, the boy said, but her mouth was smiling. Father Brown felt the chill go up his spine. There was no other woman in the village who looked like Florence. No missing persons, no travelers. But there was a photograph from 10 years ago in the records of the church youth group, Florence, and another girl, her cousin, Iris Hale. They were inseparable until Iris disappeared. Age 17, rumors of pregnancy, a nervous breakdown. Her parents moved away. No one spoke of it again. No official record of her death. No body ever found, just a silence, like a scream that never landed. Father Brown contacted the parish in another town, learned that Iris had been placed in a private home after a mental episode. The records were sealed. But one nurse remembered her, said she had vanished 2 months ago after the funding ran dry. She had nowhere to go, except maybe back to the woods where her cousin had once promised to meet her. The scream in the woods hadn't been Florence, it had been Iris. Alive, terrified, perhaps lured there, perhaps confused by what she saw, and Florence, caught in the middle of a secret too dark to understand. But if Iris had screamed, where was she now, and why was Florence dead? Father Brown kept digging, and finally he uncovered a name no one wanted to remember. Gerald Vexley, a former schoolteacher, quiet, polite, fired quietly years ago after a disagreement with Florence's father. He now worked as a groundskeeper, lived in a cottage on the edge of the forest, and in his possession they found the missing candle, unlit, untouched, but engraved with a name, Iris. When confronted, Vexley said nothing, didn't deny, didn't confirm, just said one line. She screamed, but she wasn't supposed to. Then he laughed. Not loud, not happy, just broken. He was arrested. But Iris was never found. And the truth? It dissolved between the trees. Some say she ran. Some say she died that night too, buried in a place no one thought to look. Some say she still wanders the woods, trying to scream again, but no longer able. Father Brown visited the clearing one last time, lit the candle, watched the flame flicker against the leaves, and said quietly, "She tried to scream the truth, but the truth was stolen from her mouth." Then he turned to the darkness and whispered, "I know who killed Florence." But the truth, the real truth, was screaming long before she died. Chapter 9. She lied about the knife. She said she found it after the murder, but her fingerprints were underneath the victim's blood. It was the sort of lie so small, so fragile, that no one noticed it unraveling until it was already wrapped around a corpse. The night of the garden party at Elmwood Estate had been perfect. Candles flickering in lanterns, violins humming under the old oak, champagne flutes clinking against laughter that didn't know what was coming. And then came the scream. Of course there was a scream, the sort that halts the entire world for 2 seconds, sharp and sudden, forcing every face to turn toward the darkened hedge maze where no one had dared go since the last scandal. And at the center of that maze, lit only by moonlight and shame, was a body. Paul Keswick, 48, politician, philanderer, manipulator, and now definitively a corpse. The knife was still in his chest, a pearl-handled kitchen blade that looked far too elegant to be a weapon, and yet there it was, buried so precisely that even the coroner flinched. What unsettled the crowd even more wasn't the blood, or the horror, or the silence that followed. It was the woman who emerged next. Anna Denham, breathless, pale, holding the edge of her gown like she was floating above the world. She said she had found him like that she followed a noise, that she saw someone running away. She didn't chase them. She didn't scream. She just stood there. And that's when she noticed the knife. "I picked it up," she whispered. "Without thinking. I wanted to help, but he was already gone." The constables believed her. She was poised, controlled. Her story, consistent. But Father Brown did not believe in consistency. He believed in pressure. And there was something too clean about Anna Denham's grief. Too measured. As if she had rehearsed not the crime, but the aftermath. The forensic report came back in 2 days. The fingerprints on the knife were smudged, partial but identifiable. Anna's were present, but beneath them, beneath the oil and sweat of her touch, was a layer of blood, which meant one of two things. She had touched the knife before Paul was stabbed, or she had stabbed him herself. When Father Brown asked her about it, she hesitated for the first time. Her eyes twitched, just slightly. "That's not possible," she said. "I didn't touch it until after. But the blood was already there. Then someone used it earlier. Someone else. It must have been used before tonight. But the blood matches Paul's, and it was fresh." She looked away. That was her first mistake. The second came when Father Brown asked to see the kitchen drawer where the knife came from. It was missing one slot, the blade that killed Paul. But the drawer itself had dust in the empty space, thick, undisturbed, which meant the knife hadn't been there in weeks. And yet Anna said she had never seen it before. She lied about the knife. But why? Was she covering for someone else? Or had she known exactly what it would be used for, and simply hoped no one would look that closely? Father Brown began asking questions that no one wanted asked. About Paul Keswick, about his relationships, about the whispers that followed him into every room and the letters that never arrived at their destination. It turned out that Anna Denham wasn't just a guest at the party. She had once been his campaign manager, fired quietly months earlier. No scandal, no headlines, just a story of creative differences and a polite exit. But she hadn't left quietly. In the attic of her home, hidden behind a false panel in the wardrobe, Father Brown found them. Letters, dozens of them, written in Paul's own hand. To Anna, to her sister, to a woman named Lillian, who had vanished from the village 3 years prior. The tone of the letters shifted. At first, charming, then commanding, then threatening. Paul Keswick had a talent for hiding behind charm. But on paper, stripped of his stage voice, he was something else entirely. Anna had kept them all, even the one that said, "If you speak, I'll destroy every piece of your life, one secret at a time." It was dated the week before he died. Father Brown confronted her again. She didn't deny the letters. She didn't deny the threats. But she said something that chilled him deeper than a confession ever could. "I didn't stab him," she said. "I only watched him die." That made no sense, unless someone else had held the knife, someone Anna had let in, someone Anna had wanted to see what she could not do herself. Father Brown turned to the guests. 26 people at the party. Only 3 had reason to kill Paul Keswick. But only one had the opportunity, and a matching motive. Charlotte Denham, Anna's younger sister, a nurse. and the last person to be seen leaving the conservatory, which sat just outside the entrance to the hedge maze. She said she'd gone for air, but her shoes were muddy, and in the kitchen bin, beneath a bag of orange peels, was a latex glove. Only one, stained, with blood. Too small for Paul's hands, too large for Anna's, a perfect fit for Charlotte. But the constables never found it, because Father Brown never turned it in. He burned it, because he realized the final, unbearable truth. Anna had lied about the knife not to protect herself, but to protect Charlotte. She had watched her sister kill the man who ruined both of their lives, watched without stopping it, then picked up the knife, not to help, but to claim the guilt, to protect what little innocence her family had left. She had rehearsed the lie for weeks, because she knew it would be needed, and now Father Brown was the only one who knew. He stood alone in the chapel that evening, the flames flickering in the glass. And when someone asked him, "Do you know who really killed Paul Keswick?" he answered softly, without turning his head, "I do, but the truth belongs to a knife that's already been buried." Chapter 10. A promise ended in murder. He made her promise to stay alive, and the next day, someone slit his throat and left her wedding ring on his tongue. The murder of Jonathan Wexler didn't feel like a killing. It felt like a message, written in flesh, in symbols too grotesque to ignore. He had been found in the chapel just after sunrise, slumped against the baptismal font, eyes open, mouth parted. But it wasn't the blood that shook Father Brown. It was the ring, a small silver band, unmistakably engraved on the inside. "To my soul's last breath, M." Not Jonathan's ring, not his fiancée's either. That ring had belonged to Miriam Lane, his former lover, the one who disappeared 7 years ago, without warning, without explanation, without a trace. Everyone assumed she had left him. Everyone except Jonathan. He had never taken her picture down, never given away her letters, never once accepted the word gone. And now, on the morning of his engagement to another woman, he was found murdered, with Miriam's ring shoved inside his mouth, carefully wedged between his teeth like a token of silence or revenge. Father Brown didn't speak at first. He simply knelt beside the body and listened, not for a sound, but for a lie. The constables circled the crime scene with all the precision of routine. No sign of forced entry, no broken lock. Jonathan had come early, as was his custom, to pray before the ceremony. Only the priest was supposed to be there. But that morning, the priest had fallen ill, and someone else had been waiting. The chapel doors were still locked from the inside, but the vestry window, high and narrow, had a small smudge of dried earth on the inside sill, and a single red thread caught on the latch. No one wore red that day. No one, except Miriam. Or at least, the woman everyone believed was Miriam. Because 2 nights before his murder, Jonathan was seen in town, arguing with someone in the shadows outside the old post office. The witness, an elderly clerk, said the woman had dark hair, a torn scarf, and eyes that looked like she hadn't slept in years. She called him a liar. He said something about the promise. Then she vanished. But Miriam Lane was supposed to be dead. Father Brown asked to see the parish records. 7 years ago, Miriam had requested a private audience with Jonathan, 1 week before her disappearance. No one knew what was said, but 2 days later, she mailed a single note to the vicar. "I will not break the promise." It had never been opened, filed, forgotten. Now Father Brown opened it. There was no ink, only a dried red fingerprint across the page, a smudge, barely legible. But beneath it, scratched into the parchment with a pin, were the words, "He told me to run." Jonathan had helped her disappear, and now he was dead. The new fiancée, Helen Dorsey, claimed to know nothing. She wept convincingly. But Father Brown saw something odd. She wore her engagement ring on a chain around her neck, not on her finger. When asked why, she smiled too quickly. "It was too loose," she said. "We were going to resize it." But the ring had been fitted weeks ago. Helen's lie was not about love. It was about timing. Because she had once worked at the sanatorium just outside Kembleford, the same place where, according to confidential records, Miriam Lane had been treated under a different name, Mary Linton. Helen had cared for her, and somehow Miriam had vanished from that very facility 6 months ago. No trace, no alert, no investigation. Helen had submitted the discharge paperwork herself, signed by Jonathan Wexler. But Father Brown checked the handwriting. It wasn't his. And the notary who had witnessed it? Dead, 3 months ago. An overdose. Suddenly, the narrative collapsed. Miriam hadn't vanished. She had been hidden. And then, she had been released. By Helen, who had gotten engaged to the same man Miriam once loved. And now, Jonathan was dead, murdered in a place that represented forgiveness, surrounded by symbols of redemption, with a ring in his mouth that promised neither. When Father Brown confronted Helen again, she said nothing. But her eyes did. They stared too long, too empty, as if mourning something she had rehearsed in advance. The constables searched her home, found nothing, except one item in the freezer, a vial of blood, human, unlabeled, still viable. When asked why it was there, Helen said it was part of her private research. But she wasn't a doctor, she was a nurse. And the name on the freezer's wiring receipt? M. Lane. Father Brown knew what happened then. But he also knew he couldn't prove it, because Miriam's body was never found, because Helen had covered her tracks too well, because Jonathan had kept a secret until the end, and died trying to protect it. Maybe he had broken a promise, or maybe the promise was broken for him. Either way, someone had ended a story that should have been spoken aloud long before now. And when Father Brown stood in the empty chapel that evening, alone in the candlelight, he whispered not a prayer, but a truth. "I know who killed him, but the promise they made still lives, and some vows are buried with the dead." Chapter 11. Her shadow didn't follow her. She stepped out of the train station just after dusk, and for reasons no one could explain, the streetlight cast no shadow behind her. There are things the human eye is trained to ignore. Coincidences, flickers, gaps in what should be there. And yet when Margaret Hensley arrived back in Kembleford after 20 years gone, every person who passed her claimed the same thing. She walked with purpose, looked completely unchanged, and somehow, not a single soul remembered the sound of her footsteps. She had left the village as a girl with a ruined family name, and a scandal so thick even the church bells had sounded different for a month. Now she returned in silence, her suitcase light, her eyes hollow, her voice just slightly wrong in pitch. And though she spoke kindly, offered handshakes and smiles, no one felt warm in her presence, not even Father Brown. He saw her first in the cemetery, standing by the grave of her sister, Lillian Hensley, the girl whose death Margaret had been blamed for all those years ago. The drowning had never been solved. Margaret had been found walking alone along the riverbank, her clothes soaked, her hands trembling. She claimed Lillian had slipped. The coroner ruled it an accident, but the village called it murder. and Margaret was quietly shipped off to an aunt in the north, never to be seen again, until now. But here's what made the air turn cold the night she came back. Lillian's grave had been dug open, not disturbed, emptied. The coffin inside, pristine, but bare. No bones, no cloth, nothing. And Margaret, when asked why she had returned, said only, "To pay my debt." The case should have ended there. But of course, it didn't. Because the next morning, a new grave appeared, freshly dug, unmarked. But in the center of it, carefully laid, almost respectfully, was a dress, a child's dress, the one Lillian had died wearing, recognized by the pattern, the stitching, the missing button at the collar. The police were called. The dress was examined. No DNA, no signs of decay. It was as if it had never spent a day beneath the earth. Father Brown didn't ask Margaret about the dress. He asked her about her shadow. She laughed, but not in a human way. And that was when he noticed something impossible. When she turned to walk away, the sunset behind her bled across the field, stretching shadows of trees, lampposts, headstones, but not her. She cast no shadow. And yet, she was undeniably there, solid, breathing. He said nothing, because the moment he opened his mouth, a gust of wind blew the chapel doors shut behind him. And in the silence, he heard it. A laugh, childlike, from under the floorboards. They checked the old church archives. Lillian's burial papers were incomplete. The priest who had signed them died weeks after, and the only photograph ever taken of the burial, a group shot of mourners, had a smudge where Margaret should have been standing, just a blur, like something not yet there. The village began to whisper, not about ghosts, about guilt. Margaret stayed at the old Hensley house, now decayed and overgrown. No one visited, except one boy. A paper boy who passed by said he saw two girls playing in the garden one morning, one in grey, one in white. But when his mother looked, there was only Margaret, pruning dead roses with a blade too sharp to be decorative. When asked, Margaret said she had always been alone, that her sister never really died, that people only believed she did because they couldn't bear the truth. Father Brown returned to the graveyard that evening, stood at the empty plot, and noticed something strange. The earth had settled, not as if something had left the coffin, but as if something had crawled into it. The local doctor confirmed what no one wanted to hear. The child's dress, the one left on the new grave, had traces of fresh blood at the hem. Too fresh, too recent, and there had been no reports of missing children, which meant the blood came from someone still alive. Father Brown visited Margaret one last time. He found her in the attic, looking at an old mirror. Only her reflection wasn't complete. Her face, clear, but her back, missing. A smear of light where a spine should be. "I came to finish what was started," she said, not turning. "The water didn't take her, you know." "Not really, it just made space." "For what?" Father Brown asked. "For the part of me I couldn't carry any more." And then she smiled, and for just a moment, he saw a second pair of eyes behind her own, watching, waiting. The next day, Margaret was gone. Her suitcase left behind, but not the blade. That was found under the chapel altar, clean, cold, with a single lock of blonde hair caught between the handle and the guard. Lillian's color. No one knows where Margaret went, or if she was ever really Margaret at all. But the grave was resealed, the dress burned, and the boy who saw the girls playing. He hasn't spoken since. Father Brown, when asked what really happened, only said, "She returned without her shadow, because something else was carrying it now." Then he paused and whispered, I know what crawled out of that grave, but the truth would follow you home. Chapter 12. Father Brown understood too late. The note was in his coat pocket the entire time, but by the time Father Brown read it, 3 people were already dead. It had been a quiet week, which is how these things always begin. The village of Kembleford was settling into its usual routine of soft winds and hard silences. The kind of place where people passed you with polite smiles and buried secrets. But everything changed on the morning the choir director was found dangling from the church bell tower, her face twisted not in fear, but in relief. Her hands had been clasped in front of her, as if in prayer, but there was no prayer on her lips, only one word, carved crudely into the wooden beam above her head: forgiven. Father Brown arrived before the constables. He looked up at her body, then down at the patch of disturbed earth beneath the tower, where something had clearly been buried and then removed. But no one spoke of it. No one saw anything. The church was locked, the choir room undisturbed. And yet someone had hoisted a grown woman 30 feet in the air without anyone hearing a sound. The official cause of death was suicide. But Father Brown didn't believe in neat endings, especially not when something about the position of the hands and the faint bruising at her wrists whispered otherwise. Still, he said nothing. Not yet. Because it was the second death that twisted the knife. 3 days later, the baker's wife, Elspeth Moore, was found floating in the duck pond just past the willow trees, her mouth stuffed with communion wafers. No sign of struggle, no water in her lungs. She had been dead before she ever touched the water. And on the grass nearby, drawn in sugar, not blood, were 3 circles, interlinked like a chain. Father Brown recognized the symbol instantly. It was the seal of an old theological order, disbanded decades ago, their secrets buried in Vatican archives and forgotten by everyone. Everyone except those who still suffered from their mistakes. The Order of Binding Grace, a group that believed in purging sin, not through confession, but through punishment, public or private. It didn't matter. He had seen the seal once before, carved into the floorboards of a forgotten orphanage in southern France, and now it had appeared again, in sugar, in the grass, by a body that couldn't have walked there herself. The village grew nervous. 2 deaths in a week, no explanations, no confessions, and then the third came. Mr. Harlan Penrith, retired judge, found seated upright in the front pew of the chapel, a rosary wrapped 3 times around his throat. No signs of violence, no blood, just the same symbol, carved into the side of the pew with what looked like a communion knife, and inside his mouth, a rolled scrap of paper. Father Brown was the one to pull it out. 6 words. He knew and did nothing. That was when the whispers began. People started remembering strange things, things they'd seen but never spoken of, sins they assumed had been buried. Father Brown returned to his study that evening, tired, grieved. He poured tea and reached into his coat to retrieve his notebook, but instead, his hand found something else, a folded note, old paper, torn at the edge, written in a rushed, slanted hand. Father, I know who's next. They said it would stop if I told, but I didn't. Forgive me. It was never suicide. M. There was no date, no signature beyond that single M. And that was when Father Brown realized. The choir director, the baker's wife, the judge, all connected, not by circumstance, but by silence. They had all, in one way or another, witnessed something that had happened 20 years ago, during the renovation of the chapel's basement, something Father Brown had nearly forgotten. A boy had gone missing. a quiet, fragile boy with strange eyes and softer screams. The story had been that he wandered into the woods, that he was never found, but someone had found him and buried the truth, literally, because when Father Brown returned to the base of the bell tower, he brought a lantern and a spade. He dug for 2 hours, and at last, under layers of clay and roots, he found a box. Inside, a child's sweater, torn, stained, and beneath it, a letter addressed to no one, but signed with a name that had been erased from the parish records, Marcus Ainsley, the same M. The boy hadn't run away, he had been taken, and the people who knew, they had done nothing. Some had watched, some had helped, some had simply turned away, and now someone, or something, was making them pay. Father Brown knew the next part would be unbearable, because he had to ask who would want to avenge Marcus now. There were no surviving relatives, no records, unless the file, the sealed one in the diocesan archive, the one labeled Confidential Redemption Project. He broke the seal. Inside was a photograph, a woman, mid-30s, dark eyes, wearing the robe of a lay nun, serving at a mission 2 towns over. Name, Sister Maren Ainsley, the boy's sister, adopted, forgotten, returned. Father Brown rode through the night, arrived just after dawn. She greeted him with warmth, offered tea, spoke of God, spoke of penance, and when he asked if she'd been in Kembleford recently, she didn't lie. Yes, she said. I came to see what was left. He asked if she had killed them. She looked out the window. They made a promise to protect, she whispered. They broke it. They were wrong, Father Brown said, but not all of them were wicked. She turned. Then why didn't you stop it? He had no answer. Because she was right. He had known. Not everything, but enough. Enough to ask questions. Enough to listen. But he hadn't. He had chosen peace over truth. Now the truth had claws. That night, Sister Maren vanished, left no trace. The mission said she returned to the convent. The convent said she never arrived. And Father Brown? He returned to his chapel, sat in the front pew, looked down at the carving in the wood, and whispered, I understood too late. Then he stood and walked into the dark, not to forget, but to remember. Because some truths arrive after the blood has dried and the names are etched in stone. And by then, the only thing left to do is light a candle and ask for a silence that doesn't mean guilt, but forgiveness, even when it isn't deserved.